for example, about how many two-bedroom Cape Cods are still in the city that people are buying and then tearing down and building, 4 or 5 bedroom homes. So I would anticipate that while we do look to these numbers because they are fairly accurate, we are going to also do some internal reviews like we did this last year and make modifications appropriately.
No.
I guess my question is, are we making sure that our colleagues across the way know that the potential of these new projects that are coming online in the next 5 to 10 years will have an impact, and that these Weldon Cooper numbers right now, the way that they're designed, do not necessarily reflect these projects that are already in the works that are going to come online, so that when we ask for more, it's not a complete blindside for them to think that, well, your projections didn't say, well, our projections don't
Right.
include fairly significant large projects that you're planning to build in the city that's going to bring people and will inevitably bring students to the school system.
The short answer to your question is yes. We've maintained those lines of communication with the city manager and the chief financial officer on the city side as well. In fact, some of the student yield ratios that we've put into our presentation, we got from them. So they are aware that there is going to be some student generation from these projects. Will anyone, and I won't say just them, but will anyone remember that when it actually happens? I think will be something that we've got to continue to maintain the conversation so that people are aware, we've been talking about this. And it's actually why we are building the high school, the size that we're building it is so that we can accommodate for growth into the future.
Aaron, you sure you want to leave? Because you have this nice, easy budget year that's
I said to
passed.
Greg, this is going to be part of his budget discussion this year. Sure.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Obviously, this is about as easy as predicting when the next recession comes or something like that. But and it is interesting that last week there was an article in the Washington Post about how our neighboring school divisions are struggling with accelerating growth in enrollment. And so I guess my first question is, what are our neighbors seeing? And I think and what's the difference between them and us? I think the second question is, I think it's absolutely clear that the Great Recession lowered the number of children on average that people have. I mean, if you look at your slide presentation, there is no grade below 6 that has enrollment of 200, and everyone on the other side of that, from 6 all the way up to 11, 12 is the only outliner, are over 200. And so, it seems that was an inflection point.
Right, and you're absolutely correct. One of the things that Marion is putting together is each year we present to the school board and then we share with city council the information about how many students we have at each residential address and those dwelling types. And one of the pieces of data that Marion has put together is when we look at our number of students with unique addresses, right, we are seeing that we have fewer students coming from residential addresses. So you're absolutely right, and we're going to add that data to your report in terms of students by dwelling that you'll get hopefully either later, it'll probably be later this month before our joint meeting on the 2nd. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the overall economy plays into it, and I also think activities going on in the federal government also influence us as well, right? So when you're looking at federal jobs and federal related jobs in this area, right, both our housing and economy have a strong impact, right, in terms of our students, right, that can easily switch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think it's in, this was in particular for me looking at the last figure that you showed, Ms. Michael. this is nice to see the projection, because one of the things that I think we need to persistently remind ourselves is they talk about the accuracy in their projections, Weldon Cooper, year to year. It's not that hard to get that reasonably accurate. It's a lot harder to project 5 and 10 years out, and that's where we need to be thinking in the planning. And so seeing this, just the fact that it's consistently sloping flatter and flatter, right, is a useful piece of information. But the question I'm wondering about is, and I feel like I should know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there anything that mandates that we use the Weldon Cooper Center? The city just redid their demographics chapter not too long ago, and they've got a whole bunch of new demographic results that I'm just wondering if there's anything that in there that we should tap into that we haven't been, perhaps. And I don't know to what degree we have been. But is there anything that mandates that we use Weldon Cooper Center?
No, there's nothing that mandates that we use Weldon Cooper Center to do projections. They obviously do the statewide projections, so they're an easy choice, and they're also inexpensive, right? But we certainly don't have to use their projections. And I think as we move forward and look at some of the things that are happening within our community, really working closely with our counterparts in the general government are going to be critical to ensuring that we're making the best decisions, both in the short term and the long term.
I think it's also useful to think of that as giving a common basis for understanding for both the general government and for the school board to have sort of, this is the data set that we're all working from. There's some value in that might be worth thinking about. But because I think it does, people should bear in mind that both there is fuzz in these projections, and it gets fuzzier the way you get further you go out, but also given that these projections don't include those local projects, there's additional uncertainty on top of that. And the more reminders that we can all have of those, I think the better off we are. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was very helpful, and I'm sure will inform Greg's budget discussions going forward. Next, we'll move on to 8.05, our amicus brief, Fairfax County School Board. This is an action item, and we joined in a previous amicus brief in the same case, and I'll let Ms. Vinson discuss.
Yes, as Chair Gill said, the school board did in April of this year join in the amicus brief with Fairfax, Arlington, and Alexandria in support of the student Gavin Grimm. That case was a remand of a case from the Fourth Circuit in the United States Supreme Court, and it remanded back to the Eastern District of Virginia. That court did rule on a motion for summary judgment in August of this year in favor of the student. The court did cite to the many amicus briefs that were filed on behalf of Gavin Grimm. Gloucester, the school board, has filed an appeal to the Fourth Circuit. So at this time, Fairfax County is asking us, Arlington and Alexandria, to join in the amicus brief before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And if the court does, if you all do agree to doing it, it would be as the appellee, since the appellant is the school board. Any questions about this?
I'll go.
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what's going to be different about this brief?
It's going to be very similar to the brief that was filed in the Eastern District. They are looking for the school divisions to see if there's any updates in the information that was provided previously, as far as any complaints that they've received from the public, any other things that they've been doing differently in the 5 months since the previous brief was filed.
There's no further questions. I would seek a motion that we join this brief.
I move that the board join in the amicus brief of Fairfax County School Board and other Virginia school districts in support of the student in the GG versus Gloucester County School Board litigation.
Thank you, Ms. Russell. Second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed or abstained? All right, back to Ms. Vinson for 8.06, our approval and adoption of second reading of policies.
Woo! You all are going to ask me to slow down here. I have 9 policies for second reading, but the good news is very few of these have any changes from first reading. So I'm going to speed through, and if you need me to slow down, please let me know. The first policy is IKF. This would replace current policies 6.14 and 6.15, the Virginia Assessment Program and Graduation Requirements. There were no changes other than adding the word "the" on line 22 from first reading. Any questions about the Virginia Assessment Program? Hearing none. Policy IKEB, acceleration, would replace former policy 6.15 and 6.44. The changes to this are reflected in red. Rather than saying his or her, in all of the policies, we're going to be saying their and non-gender pronouns. Also added that the parent or the guardian may request that a grade be omitted from the student transcript. The one point for this policy is I know that William and Jeannie have worked hard to have a regulation that'll be ready to go as soon as this policy is adopted by the board. Questions about policy IKEB? Hearing none. Policy IAA is a new policy. We currently do not have a policy that provides for the notification of learning objectives, but this is something that we have been doing as a practice. There were no changes to this policy from first reading. Questions on IAA? All right. IKHA, retaking SOL assessments, is another policy where we had been doing this in practice, but there had been no policy in place. There were no changes from first reading. Policy IGAH, Family Life Education, or FLE, would replace our current policy 6.28. This is very similar in language to what had been in our previous policy, but is consistent with what our current practice is, and there were no changes proposed from first reading. Next is policy BFC, policy adoption. This would replace bylaw 2.3. There were no changes from last reading, and this is very similar to our current bylaw 2.3. Any questions on BFC? Policy BF, Board Policy Manual, would replace our current bylaw 2.3. This in many ways is similar to what our current policy is, and there were no changes from first reading. Any questions?
Not to break the stride, but
That's
I do
fine.
actually have a suggestion for, I'd like to almost make a motion on this one for the board to consider, but on line 6 and 12, we use the word citizens as opposed to members of the public or the public. I'd like to suggest that we consider altering that. So,
It would be easy enough to replace citizens at line 6 with the public and is needed to the public who do not have online access. Is that agreeable to?
So that would require, I think, an amendment.
So when the motion is read, if someone says as amended from, okay. Any other questions on BF?
I do think there's a context in which citizen is not citizen, but just means community members. Having said that, I mean, so I don't know that I don't think there's anything wrong with the solution. I just am not sure how big the problem is. So,
yeah, I fairly admit there could easily be legal precedent on that it is more broad. My first reaction upon it was thinking, for some folks, there are certainly parents and guardians in the city that aren't citizens and members of the community that aren't citizens who still should have a right to access to the information, so.
How would the board like to handle that? Change it to the public? Keep it as citizen?
Is it intended to only be people who reside in Falls Church City, or does this truly mean anyone?
I would imagine it's sorry. I won't speak for the board, but I would imagine it's anyone because we have people that are thinking of moving here.
Yeah, and that would be consistent with the language that's on line 11, which talks, 9 to 11. A current copy
Public.
of all division policies, and then I'll skip, are posted on the website and available to employees and the public. So that to me, so in the end, I guess I would suggest when we get to the motion that I would amend the motion to say with the word, and members of the public as opposed to citizens.
Okay. Policy BFE will also be policy CHD, administration and policy absence. This would replace former bylaw 2.3. And the language is, oh, I'm sorry. The language is very similar to our previous policy, but a question came up on first reading